Recording in progress. Thank you very much. Now we are recording, and this is an introduction to queer theology. This presentation originated actually as something that I worked on in my PhD program a couple of years ago in a seminar on theology and ethics, so sort of putting together the frameworks to do the work we need to do. And sometimes people talk about queer theology as building a framework to tear all the other ones down. You'll see what I mean when we get there. So to be able to think about queer theology, I need to give you a couple of disclaimers at the front. The first is every single part of this presentation will be simplified to the point of near absurdity. So if things come up and you're like, that doesn't seem exactly right, you are right. It is not. It is a simplification, but I think we'll get to the sort of broad strokes of it. So that's okay. The second disclaimer is I'm not an expert on any of this. I am an interested engager of this material, but I am far from an expert. So there may be things that you're like, oh, I want to learn more about that. I can direct you to resources. I may not know the answer. That's okay. But that being said, worth doing, worth engaging. So on with the work. In order to understand queer theology and to situate ourselves, we have to start with the concept of postmodernity. Some of you in the room will certainly have more background in postmodernity than I do. But the broad strokes, when we talk about postmodernity, we're talking about both a historical period and an academic movement, which touches all sorts of different fields. Philosophy, arts, architecture, all these different fields have a sort of postmodern movement in them. It includes a general skepticism towards, if not an entire rejection of, the ideologies, particular and sort of ideologies in general. The idea that we can have an organizing framework, grand narrative, objective reality, that we can identify things clearly and know them as they are, which is a hallmark of modernity. Postmodernity says, I don't know about that. Knowledge and truth are contextual. They're different in different places. Different things, contradictory things can be true at the same time. Here are some black and white pictures of white men, mostly Europeans. This is sort of where this comes from. So some major names that you might hear of identified with postmodernity. But the main point that we need from this is that postmodernity made room for contextual theologies. Because of that rejection of a sort of overarching grand narrative that's true for everyone, it made room for people to start doing some things that were specific. So like Gustavo Gutierrez, who is one of the fathers of liberation theology in Latin America, who said, we know things in our context about God and about the world that are true for us, that are known only because of our context. I also have James Cone here, who is an AME pastor, but also a very, very, very well-known professor and author in Black theology, the originator of this sort of rooted in Black experience. Likewise, one of my heroes, Rosemary Radford Ruther, feminist theology, who said women know things because of our experience in the world that are different. Right? So contextual theologies, people who said this is ours, this is specific to us. And then those and others, I should say, contextual theologies began to cross-pollinate. So people started to say, well, not just feminist theology or Black theology, but womanist theology. Dolores Williams and a bunch of other incredible women did work that continues in saying there's something specific to the experience of Black women, womanist theology, or indigenous theology that says it's not really just about being a racialized person, it's also about being indigenous. Mujerista theology, which is sort of the cross-pollination of Latin American theology and womanist, feminist theology, Asian feminist theology, people kind of claiming their position and saying, there is something here that I know, that we believe, that we practice, that's specific, that we know because of our context. This is all possible because of postmodernity, right? So additional cross-pollination, we're getting closer to queer theology, or at least it might feel that we're getting closer, right? Gay theology, John McNeill and others particularly Roman Catholic priests who did a lot of really interesting work in gay theology, or Carter Hayward originating a movement of lesbian theology. Marcella Athos Reed, who did some really amazing work in bisexual, pansexual theology. What does it mean? What do we know because of the experiences of our bodies and our communities, our social locations, our relationships, not to mention lots of other important contextual movements in other sort of corners of the LGBT world, Black gay theology, Latinx queer theology, right? These kinds of LGBT immigrant theology, these very sort of rooted in particular context theologies. And this is all not to mention, of course, LGBT related movements of theology in non-Christian space. LGBT Muslims actually do quite a lot of work. There's a lot of organizing in that community. So that's really important to keep in mind. So these kind of specific theologies that we would say gay theology or lesbian theology, here are some things they have in common. Prioritizing of experience as a source for doing theology. So when we talk about this, a source for theology, we're talking about where do we look to that has some authority? The Bible maybe, or tradition. Different corners of the Christian world treat authority differently, but gay and lesbian theology and other contextual theologies have in common a prioritizing of experience as a source, an authoritative source, something that tells you the truth. Gay and lesbian theology and other kind of specific contextual theologies around sexuality also have in common an understanding of a stable sexual identity. So that's really important, that people have the sense that maybe it's biologically driven or it could be socially constructed, but it's stable enough to work with.
I don't know why our camera didn't.
That we can sort of work with it there. Other contextual theologies also affirm experience and highlight communal identity, focused on sort of people who have something in common with each other, right? So there are some criticisms of contextual theologies. Some people say, well, they're exclusive. You can't get in, you can't be part of a conversation about them, because how can you criticize each other's experience? How does it build? How does it create something? There's also some criticism that they're essentialist, that they sort of make people into something that can be defined by one characteristic. So the most important characteristic, my theology is lesbian theology, for example, which means that none of the other characteristics of me are as important. There is a criticism of contextual theologies that has to do with sin. So people might say, well, they only talk about sort of systemic sin, and they don't really make room for people to experience it. This is especially something that was levied against liberation theology, that said it only talks about systems and it doesn't talk about individuals. Like how do we deal with individual responsibility? Some people have criticisms that they're syncretistic. This especially has to do with, so syncretistic means bringing two traditions together. In particular, we often are talking about Christianity plus something else, some kind of indigenous tradition often. And people criticize, especially racialized contextual theologies, that they're syncretistic. And maybe the sort of most common criticism is that they're only useful as criticisms of dominant theology. They don't have enough oomph to build something themselves, that they're only about tearing something else down. These are not necessarily things I agree with. They're just things that people say. So part of the conversation that gets us where we're going are these criticisms. So meanwhile, in the secular academy, as this is all developing and people are working through these kind of contextual theologies, a movement called structuralism arises, which the primary contention of structuralism is that we should look at structures. Like systems and structures are the organizing principle through which we should be examining what else is going on in our lives. Phenomena are intelligible. We can understand things based on how they interact with each other in these structures or systems. Structuralism, I have put here, succeeded existentialism as the dominant European intellectual mode. So the way people are making sense of things moves into this sort of structuralist model. So that's important. And then people pushed back to that and And we're part of a movement called post-structuralism that rejects the idea that structures sort of exist in a stable way. Structuralism sort of posits that you can analyze these things because they're stable, they exist. You can identify individual bits that engage with each other. And post-structuralism basically says meaning itself is unstable, it changes, you can't pin it down. And that to understand an object, you have to also understand the system of knowledge that produced the object or thing. So how did we come to even make sense of this thing in the first place? We have to sort of understand the process and the system and how we think things mean in relation to each other in an unstable way. Don't worry if this is all feeling like, oh my God, this is too much. I'm not expecting you're going to walk away with like a working knowledge of post-structuralism. You can probably tell I barely have like a little pinch on this. But it's important as part of the story of what brought us to queer theology. The next important thing you need to know that happened in the secular academy is the rise of what's called critical theory. Critical theory, which has a lot of sort of specific pointed things and also a sort of broad basket that a lot of things work in. The things you need to know, which this is also an embarrassingly shallow glance at critical theory, but basically we're looking at society broadly. We're looking at stuff as a whole in an interdisciplinary way, expecting disciplines to talk to each other, to criticize each other, to help build what comes next. And the most important probably is that it's an activist academic movement. Critical theory says things should change when it's not descriptive, it's not primarily descriptive, and it describes with an aim towards creating a society that meets people's needs, basically. So when we talk about critical, people sometimes think that means negative in this sense, but it really just means looking at how it's critical of capitalism in a lot of ways. It's critical of the ways that the whole system is sort of based on an idea of production, an idea of work, an idea of concentrating things in a particular direction. So out of these sort of passionate movements and people wrestling with each other comes queer theory. So queer theory arises out of this sort of churn, which includes both queer reading of texts and theorizing about queerness itself. These are two different projects. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But queer readings of texts sort of turns a traditional reading in some way, in a broad way or in a specific way. This builds on feminist critiques of the idea that gender and sexuality is essential. Feminism came up with that critique and said, wait a second, what does this all mean? What even is woman? What even is gender? So queer theory sees gender, sexuality, relationships as both socially constructed, so that means we're making it up together, we're building it by doing it, and unstable. Things change over time. So what we meant by a word or what we meant by an idea in the past might not be what we mean by it later. And what we mean by it now might not mean the same thing as what we mean later. Queer theory criticizes the idea of a stable homosexual identity. That's important. This kind of, it pushes back against this idea that you can make an equivalence, that you can say, okay, well, you know, gay people are just like straight people except they're gay. So queer theory kind of pushes back against that and says, well, identity politics misses this whole thing, which is that this is all more complicated and less stable than we thought. At the same time, it pushes back against the idea of a normative heterosexuality, which means it pushes back against the idea that being straight is the norm and anything else deviates from that norm, right? So I just like putting all these beautiful faces at the bottom because I just think of all these as like my sort of network of people. Some of them have gone on and are supervising remotely from heaven now. So queer theory. So we get this conversation, right? We have this stuff coming from the secular academy, queer theory, critical theory, post-structuralism. We have this stuff that we talked about before, contextual theologies, gay and lesbian theologies, and you put them together with a little creative explosion, you get queer theology. I will put some quotes. I think these are just a little bit of a helpful taste. Some of these are names. Some people in the room will certainly know more about this than I will. Some will know less. If this feels like, too much, don't worry. That's okay. I felt that way. Sometimes I still feel that way. It's complicated. And the part that's fun is because it's so complicated. It's so complicated that there is enough space to play. That's why this is part of my favorite corner of theology. So a free-floating relation between sex, gender, and desire, and seeks to reflect theologically from that perspective. So what does it mean to think, what if our only stable identity is that of a member of the people of God, that all other identities are relativized by that, including sexual identity and gender identity? What if we said the only stable identity is the relationship, the identity that is the relationship to God? What does that mean? That's a queer theological perspective, to say it destabilizes all this other stuff, right? So I like this one from Laurel Schneider because I like that it names the tension that, like, there's some real desire in us for something stable. There's some real desire in us for something that is everlasting. And there's looking out at the world as it is and seeing things change. And that tension, which can feel devastating, can also be powerful and creative and dynamic. The tension between what is and what could be, the tension between the desire for something that lasts and the recognition that everything is changing, that everything alive is changing and moving. And here's a really important one: the queer project of deconstructing heterosexual epistemology. Epistemology is about, how do we know things? How do we know things? How do we make sense of what we see and do? How do we know what we know? If our epistemology is rooted in normative heterosexuality, if the way we make sense of the world is rooted in the idea that it is normal to be straight and abnormal not to be, what would it mean to deconstruct that, to find all the ways that idea informs the way that we make sense of the world, and to try to peek behind the curtain and see what things would look like if we didn't do that? Because as we do that, we also unveil a face of God that was hidden behind that heterosexual epistemology, the face of God that is different, right? So here's a really classic quote about the word queer that I go back to a lot because I actually get a lot of questions about the word queer. If you read First Church's email newsletter, The Carillon, you will have seen a little article from me this week that references the word queer. I come back to this because people wonder, why should we use this word? It was a slur. I still sort of think of it as a slur. I don't know how to make sense of it. I'm uncomfortable. And I will say, I am not aiming to apply the word queer to anybody who doesn't want it applied to them. I am not looking to point it towards people that don't want it pointed towards them. But I am looking to examine what's possible with the word queer, because queer does this thing where it says, you're never done. You're never done asking your questions, because there's always maybe a little bit more, right? A deep questioning, or an exercise of multiple and diverse hermeneutical suspicions. What do we bring to the table? What are our multiple and diverse hermeneutical suspicions? What questions do we bring? Hermeneutics is really kind of about what questions do we bring at the core of it. How do we engage with texts or with knowledge? What questions do we bring? How do we bring continually queer questions? Weirder and weirder, farther and farther from what we think we already know, making space for God to show up in increasingly queer ways. So queer theology is kind of a twofold project. We talked about this a little bit. The first is the project of queering texts or theologians, which basically means going back and saying, what in this might be queer? Where might there be space for queer stuff to happen in this? So people might say, gosh, I want to do a queer reading of this particular Bible text. Or for example, what I did this morning with the creation story in Genesis, where I said, this doesn't mean that God created binaries. This means that God created more, that God wanted things to be different from each other. That's a queer project. Going in and saying, what would it mean to ask queer questions of this? What would it mean to invite space? And the second is building theology from a queer perspective. So somebody who comes in and says, what do I know because of my experience as a queer person or because of my experience engaging in queer space, building, constructing theology, making sense of theology from a queer perspective. Those are interlocking. Those are not totally separate, but it's important to keep both in mind. One of the really important things that I think queer theology reminds us, which we touched on already a little bit, but I'm bringing it back because I just think it's so important. There is a tendency in contextual theologies, particularly contextual theologies that have to do with sexuality, to say people who are closest to the center of power are doing it right, and people who are farthest are doing it wrong. And this is something that's really important for someone like me to keep in mind, because in a lot of ways, I am a pretty palatable gay person because I am pretty gender conforming. You know, you expect me to look like a woman, and I do. I'm also white. I also dress the way you normally expect. I am in a marriage, a stable monogamous marriage. I am educated and comfortable speaking about these topics. I have enough money that I can sort of perform Western life in the way that people expect me to, which would mean that it would be really easy for me to say, well, you know, this is what a good lesbian looks like me, because I'm pretty close to the center of power. And queer theology is important because it continually tries to destabilize the idea that there are sort of good queers and bad queers, people who are close or people who are far, people who are performing gender in a particular way or performing relationships in a particular way, and people that are farther from that. So that's, I think, really important. And I'll end with a few pieces of criticism that people have offered, which is to say we are continually querying queer theology for the next questions. Sometimes people ask whether queer theology, and this is sort of a bigger question about postmodernism, can it provide frameworks for moral judgment? Can we ask questions about what's right and wrong? Can we decide how to do things together using these frameworks? This is a question that's particularly directed towards Judith Butler a lot. If gender is primarily something we perform, something we act out that's socially constructed, what happens to feminist politics? What happens to questions about oppression? What happens to like women's pay gap? You know, how do we talk about power dynamics if we're also talking about gender as something that's destabilized and strange? And the third one, really, which I think queer theology really tries to get into this, but it, you know, we're sometimes more successful than other times. Where did liberation theology's criticism of capitalism go? Liberation theology had this really profound criticism of capitalism out of their context. So how can queer theology also make sure that it is not so busy thinking about identity language and thinking about this sort of individual experience, that we can make sure that we're also seeking justice and resisting domination? So can queer theology do these tasks? I think yes, but important to keep in mind. So queer theology in an extremely inadequate nutshell. I'm going to turn off my slideshow and say a little bit more about why I named this. Let me stop the screen share so you can see me better. Come on now, stop share. There we go. And then I'll turn off the recording. But what I want to say is this presentation is entitled Queer Theology for Everyone, and not just queer theology for queer people. Because to me, it's really important that queer theology is not the same as other contextual theologies where it's kind of rooted in a particular context liberating for those people. I think queer theology is liberating for all of us because it makes space for all of us to think about all of our characteristics and all of our identities as less stable than we think, and as more open to change than we think, and as more open to what God might call us to do next than we think. As much as I sort of think that my sexual orientation is sort of stable, it feels stable, I'm open to the possibility that something might change. I'm open to the possibility that other aspects of my identity might change, because we don't know. What will I learn next? What will I be exposed to next? Who might I meet who invites me into something that I don't even know exists yet? And I feel that little spark that says, oh, there's something new. This is there for all of us. This is there for all of us, regardless of exactly where we understand our identity right now. And to me, I think that's the sort of liberating core of queer theology, and the liberating core of why we're engaging with the challenging word queer this month, why we're inviting people with intersectional identities to come and lead other services this month, why we're talking about Juneteenth and Pride together, or disability and Pride together, or racial issues and gender issues at the same time, because all of this invites us into a bigger picture of what God might be doing right now in the world. So, with that said, I will turn off the recording.